Again, glad to be with all of you. We'll just jump right into the 4th chapter of John. Let's see, get all these things in the right spots. There we go. Quick review from last week. We looked at Nicodemus and Jesus' invitation to be born again or born from above, that fun that happened there. And again, that deeper conversation where people are on different levels. Jesus is always on one level, and people listening are always on a different level, which is probably the way God often talks to us, quite frankly. We also had the final verses around John the Baptist and his declaration that he is not the Messiah, but Jesus is the Messiah, and that he must increase, or that John must decrease, while Jesus will increase. So that was just a quick look back. But I want to jump straight in to this week, and I'm going to do a little differently. Usually we read the verse and then engage, but this one actually needs some introduction for the 4th chapter before we read it. And there's a reason. That is, if you were a faithful Jew in the 1st or even 2nd century, you would know that this 4th chapter is a very specific biblical story that has clear antecedents. That is, so you know this following facts about the world. 1, water was and still is largely the responsibility of women. If you go to I'm sure Lynn's daughter could give us all kinds of information about this, that women and girls tend to be the ones who have to go and get water, go to wells to get water for cooking, cleaning, drinking, all those kinds of things, especially in sub-Saharan Africa where it is scarce. The same was probably true in 1st century Palestine, that they did not have water always nearby, and that you either had to dig a well or you would have to go to a well, or both. And even then, that was often brackish. It was not always the cleanest of waters. And as I'll mention again later, it's roughly 30 minutes to an hour for every time you go to the well in that process. And in that case, you can only carry about 2 to 3 gallons. So when you think about how much water we use a day, and it takes you an hour or so to get 2 or 3 gallons, you have a pretty good idea that you can spend almost your whole day just going after water sometimes in these situations. But in the ancient world and even in the modern, it largely follows to women. Scripture gives us a clear view then of dating rituals. If the women have to go to the well to get water, then men know where to go to find women. It's just that simple a line. Isaac, Jacob, Moses all go to the well to meet a woman. Technically, Isaac's manservant goes on his behalf, but all 3 have stories that very explicitly show that this is a sort of dating, courting ritual. When a man goes to a well, he meets his future wife. That's how it works. Jacob ends up with 2 wives. Moses finds Zipporah. Isaac gets his manservant goes and finds his bride as well. So we should hear echoes here of literally going to the watering hole. That's what our wonderful English turn of phrase is, but that's the same idea, right? Going to the watering hole is where this comes from. So the idea, the pattern that emerges in those stories, in the story of Isaac, of Jacob, and of Moses is clear. There's a 4-step process, give or take. First, the man meets a woman at the well, and they have a conversation. They start to chat. And after a while, if things seem to be going well, the man asks the woman for a drink of water. And then after that, if things go really well, the couple goes and speaks to the woman's family to make a marriage deal. And to close that deal, the 4th part of that is, if all parties are agreed, you seal the engagement with a meal shared between everyone gathered. All right. We have to know this before we read the 4th chapter, because the 4th chapter is Jesus goes to a well and meets a woman. And any 1st century Jew, any student of Scripture should immediately go, wait a second, I know this story. I know how this goes. He's meeting a woman at a well. He's getting a drink of water. Is he getting married? What's happening? Thomas Brody, one of the guys that I think is particularly brilliant with the Gospel of John, Dominican author of that book, The Gospel According to John, a literary and theological commentary, makes the point this way. It's like watching a movie showdown at the OK Corral, right? For us in 21st century America. Without any explanation, you know the bad guy wears black, the good guy wears white, someone's going to shoot somebody. There's, you know as soon as you see people sort of standing at a certain distance looking at each other, that there is this very prototypical scene that we have seen a million times in movies and TV shows. And then you also know something is happening when they both wear black, or they are both on the same side, or there different things are happening, right? Whenever somebody starts to play with that formula, you realize that something more is being said without even having to do the work. So Brody rightfully says, in the same way we should be approaching the 4th chapter of John, because it absolutely is immediately that pattern that would be as well known to all of the folks gathered and listening to this story as a showdown is known to folks in this world. So we need to listen with a very specific ear. This is a scene that typically leads to engagement in marriage. In effect, what Brody's saying is we're getting ready to look at a romantic comedy. So we need to look at it like a romantic comedy and not like a historical facts and figures or other ways of doing it like that. Instead, we really need to be thinking about the 4th chapter and these ideas of people flirting, of joking, of teasing, perhaps even of falling in love. And so that's the question. When we look at this, are they flirting? Are they falling in love? And what is going on? Again, people would catch this instantaneously. When we read the passage, I'll pull some threads just so you can see it more, but it's very, very clear. Questions before we jump into the chapter? Okay, well then we'll jump right in. So, beginning, this is again the 4th chapter of John, 1st verse. Now when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard Jesus is making and baptizing more disciples than John, although it was not Jesus himself, but his disciples who baptized, he left Judea and started back to Galilee, but he had to go through Samaria. So he came to a Samaritan city called Sychar, near the plot of ground that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired out by his journey, was sitting by the well. It was about noon. A Samaritan woman came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." His disciples had gone to the city to buy food. And the Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a woman of Samaria?" Jews do not share things in common with Samaritans. But before I go anywhere, there is one thing that we have to say about these texts, and this is true for all of the New Testament, but especially in John. They love to put in parenthetical phrases, the translators do, but it's the translators. And they're probably fair, but in ancient Greek, there is literally no punctuation at all. It's just word after word after word on a sentence. There's not a period, there's not question marks, there's not quotation marks, and there's not parenthetical little marks. So as a result, this is just a way that someone, even when we read the text like this, it tends to be one then that someone has made editorial choices, right? So for instance, in chapter 7, Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." Well, that's what it says in the Greek, "Give me a drink." And that's probably a very easy one to mark. But then when it says his disciples had gone to the city to buy food, that parenthetical is a very clear choice to say, this is a little side explanation of what had happened. And the same, Jews do not share things in common with Samaritans. It happens a lot in John, where the author seems to be giving people a little bit more info, but not necessarily, it's not a record of what happened, right? But it's just a name. So what do we hear in these opening verses? What do we see or hear or think, knowing that this is most likely a romantic comedy?
Well, Jesus isn't afraid to mix it up, to engage with the Samaritan woman who's from a different heritage.
Absolutely. Not afraid at all to mix it up. Not afraid to cross that particular, if it is forbidden or if there is a boundary, he's not afraid to cross it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he speaks first.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, and I think it was just a asking for water. He was flirting. I think as maybe other people would go to the well to flirt and find a woman.
Right. He could have just been thirsty, right? It's the middle of the day. It's hot. Yeah. Just a quick reminder, how many sons and wives did Jacob have?
Oh, gosh.
Israel had?
12.
12, yes. He had 12 sons, 2 wives, 2 concubines, and the daughters don't even get names, so we can assume there were probably a decent number of daughters as well. So there's another level here. It's Jacob's well, right? So also Jacob met his 2 wives at a well. Here is Jacob's well. He had lots of kids. I mean, again, this is another way of making that very clear suggestion that Jesus is in a conversation with a woman at a well. What does this mean? What is this going on, right? Real quick background on Samaritans. No one tends to know this about the Samaritans. The Samaritans claimed to be one of the lost tribes of Israel. Judah and the southern kingdom were conquered by Babylon, and there was not just one deportation, there were 3. So they were conquered in 597, and they took about a third of the population. In 587, they took another third or so of the population. And then in 582, they took the remaining leaders off into captivity to Babylon. But every text is clear, they never took everyone. It was always, there was a remnant that was left to help Babylon continue to run the cities and to continue to work the fields, a variety of ways of doing that. It was mainly the leadership were taken in those eras. The Samaritan, while Jews very clearly say they were the leadership that went into exile, and they trace their lineage through that, the Samaritans claim to be the folks that were left behind, right? And so that group, that community, understood themselves to be the faithful remnant of Israel, and that they were the true adherents to Judaism, and that what happened is when those leaders went into captivity, they changed their faith, they changed the Jewish faith and wrote things down and decided to follow different rules than what those who had been left behind followed. And so you literally have this argument of between the two, where Samaritans would say, well, this is what we did before you guys went into captivity and you changed everything. And the leadership comes back and say, no, this is the new way of being church. This is the new way of, well, not being church. This is the new way of being faithful Jews, right? And so this is the big argument that is, again, some 500 years later, after those captivity moments, almost 6, that they're having this back and forth exchange. And so they believe it's 2 sects of Judaism. It's a family squabble. And it still exists. There are still Samaritans in Israel. They're one of the largest groups in the West Bank. But they are this sort of fascinating group that has a very different belief system, but very related in a lot of ways. They absolutely have Passover and a whole variety of worshiping processes that are the same as Israel, and yet some of it's also distinct and very different. And whenever you hear Jesus talk about the Good Samaritan, or in this case, he goes to through Samaria and talks to this woman, it's basically, I guess it'd be equivalent. You could probably say it's equivalent to Episcopalians and the breakaway Anglicans having conversations, right? It's not impossible, but there's a lot of fraught history there, and back and forth, and people suing each other and yelling at each other and fighting each other over all kinds of different things, large and small. So it's not a completely like we hate you kind of thing, but it's definitely some strident opinions about who's right and who's wrong. But we can say as well is Jesus may have, whether he was asking for a drink of water or instituting a sort of courting ritual, she is very much not interested. She's like, look, buddy, you're a Jew, I'm a Samaritan, we don't mix. This is not going anywhere. She shuts him down, even if it is she doesn't say, oh, well, let me get you a glass of water. I know you're thirsty. She's immediately understanding it as a courting ritual. She's like, I'm not supposed to share a cup of water with you, much less start dating you. So we have an interesting start to the conversation. Anything else stand out in the passage? And I think I put it up here. Yeah, there it is. I was there.
Mhm.
Okay, well, we'll keep going. So after this moment, Jews do not share things in commons with Samaritans, right? So she has put him off. Jesus answers her, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. And the woman said to him, sir, you have no bucket. The well is deep. Where do you get that living water? Are you greater than our ancestor Jacob, the well, and with his sons and his flocks drank from it? So, context again is everything. We can read this part of the text in two ways. It can be just an innocent back and forth between Jesus and the woman about getting a drink of water. And Jesus sort of giving these almost esoteric responses about living water. And the woman simply saying, like, well, you don't have a bucket. How are you going to manage to pull up this magical water that you're talking? That's certainly part of it. But if we know there's a romantic flirting element, then it's a little bit more playful banter, right? I mean, it could be, I guess for lack of a better term, it can be one of those old 1950s biblical epic movies, King of Kings or whatever, and Jesus is so otherworldly and everyone around him is so deferential that there's almost not a real conversation half the time. Everyone's like, oh, teach me. Or it can be more of a joking, teasing back and forth. Living water. What does Jesus mean here? Now, I said in John does this a lot. There are puns going on. Living water certainly can mean what Jesus goes on to explain in the next passage a good deal about, that living water can be this idea of abundant life, of a new and spiritual life. But he hasn't said that yet. Instead, he just told this woman, I can get you living water. This is one of those things that you don't see written down many places, but I learned directly from my Greek professor at seminary. Living water is a Greek euphemism for semen. And so, Jesus might well have been referring to living water, talking about it in a spiritual sense. It's also possible that the woman heard it in that same way that they hear on different levels, right? And that she might well have heard it in these terms of sexual innuendo and joking and teasing. And so then if you listen to it that way, when he says, hey, give me a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water. Again, we can read it in that spiritual, sacred, like, oh, sir, you have no bucket. The well is deep. Where did you get this living water? Or she can also say it in a sort of teasing, flirting, sexual innuendo response, like, hey, buddy, how are you going to get that living water? It can be in a teasing way. It can be in that joking way. And her reference then to our ancestor Jacob, remember the guy who had 12 kids, who had 12 sons and 4 women that he took care of, and all his flocks and all these other people? It can be a serious and spiritual kind of conversation, but I really think ultimately it's much more, again, this whole scene is context. It's all about flirting. It's all about dating rituals and courting. So when he gives this line, she might well be very much engaging that flirting. Okay, well, I told you I'm a Samaritan and you're a Jew, but if you want to keep flirting, I'll flirt a little. I'll tease a little. Makes people uncomfortable. Jesus as flirt. But I love it because he's just being human and he's a guy and he's just talking to someone at a well and having a good time engaging. What else do we see here in this passage?
You see anything?
Well, it's interesting to me that they, to me, when you read all these Bible scriptures, it's like that time, and to see puns and other types of things like that makes it a little more realistic to me.
Yeah, I mean, they're two human beings, right? They're not, well, Jesus is undoubtedly divine. They're just two people meeting at a well having a conversation. All right, so Jesus goes on and says to her, everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again, but those who drink of the water that I will give them will never be thirsty. The water that I will give will become in them a spring of water gushing up to eternal life. And the woman said to him, Sir, give me this water so that I may never be thirsty or have to keep coming here to draw water. Again, we can have this as a purely sacred and reflective conversation back and forth, or it can be some continued flirting and back and forth of like, hey, I've got something special to give you. Oh, wait, great, I'd love to have that. It can go both ways. It can be double entendre and it can be serious conversation. And if we're really honest, flirting is serious conversation in its own right. It just has a different connotations a lot of times. Either way, the woman seems interested in either side of the pun. She would love to not have to come to the well anymore. Like I said earlier, in our current world, it's an average 30-minute journey each way to collect water, 2 to 3 gallons at a time, consuming, and this is an estimate from the United Nations, 200 million hours a day of women's time is wasted with literally collecting water, just going to get water to cook, to clean, to bathe, all those kinds of things. And so some of the most effective poverty relief programs in the world are around water, around actually what Lynn's daughter does with how do you have sanitation without water so that you draw down on that side of it, or how do you simply have a degree of centralized water that people can come and get that's just closer and more sterile. Things we take for granted in our world, but if you think about how much water we use, think about having to go get it a bucket at a time. Suddenly you realize just how much we take for granted being able to turn on a faucet. So on one level, the woman is certainly, she's like, well, I would love to not have to come back to this stupid well ever again. That would be awesome. She goes again with that literal, Jesus is inviting to this deeper conversation the way he does always in John. And she's going with the literal, like, well, if I don't have to come carry buckets everywhere, that'd be great. Give me whatever you got, buddy. What else do we see or hear in that passage? Nope, that's on the board.
Well, the woman's pretty clever. I mean, she and also pretty bold. I mean, it's kind of a here's this guy sitting by himself at the well who probably looks like some sort of peasant Jew, and she said, well, you're going to compare yourself to our patriarch Jacob? It's like, come on, man. and then he starts out asking for water, and so she flips it around and is talking about getting water from him.
Mm-hmm.
Sir, give me this water again.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this is Marcy. I've heard a couple of people on today's meeting say Jesus asked for water, but the text says, give me water. It sounds like instructive to me. And I know I've always read this as my Western feminist, worldview, but it always puts me off, and it's that he's demanding water. It's the way it comes off to me, but.
Oh, yeah. I hadn't thought of that, but I mean, it's certainly what it says, doesn't it? If there's not the please or could you help me with a drink of water, or it does seem much more of a demand.
Which is more also interesting if we're going to take the conversation as being playful or flirtatious or friendly banter back and forth with this clever woman who's, can give the zingers right back. It's sort of weird to balance that if he started off with a demand and then it turned into a friendly, playful conversation.
Yeah. That is interesting. I hadn't thought of that. That's good.
And maybe that was typical of the relationship between men and women of that day. Although I want to think that Jesus wasn't behaving in typical ways along those lines, but in that one statement, he is demanding.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
Yeah, in that Western sort of conversation, Marcy, like you were saying, a lot of times because he says something, I can't remember where, but he said, "Woman, help me with this too," right? He uses that term "woman." But in the Gospel of John, he uses that several times. He refers to his mom asks him to help with changing water to wine, and he says, "Woman, what problem is that with me?"
Right.
That seems to have been an accepted form of response more than a like. If someone said "woman" now, there might be a fight pretty good. Go get me that woman. Would not go well. But it seems to be when Jesus is saying that's perhaps an acceptable response or engagement between men and women. If he's going to call his mom woman, then he's probably not going to have too much of a battle at the same time when he refers to this person as woman. And unfortunately, she never gets a name. I wish she had gotten a name or one been recorded.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we'll go to the next. So Jesus said to her, "Go, call your husband and come back." And the woman answered him, "I have no husband." And Jesus said to her, "You are right in saying, 'I have no husband,' for you have had 5 husbands, and the one you have now is not your husband. What you have said is true." The woman said to him, "Sir, I see that you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you say that the place where people must worship is in Jerusalem." Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. The hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father seeks such as these to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth." All right, so we might have been flirting, but now Jesus is taking a turn and doing a little different. What do y'all see in those particular passages or here?
It seems, well, obviously he knows what her situation is, and the passage about the one you have now is not your husband. Is there judgment attached to it? Is it just an observation?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. I honestly don't see judgment in that. I mean, Jesus in the Gospel of John and in all the Gospels is never afraid to say like, that isn't right, or you shouldn't do this, or you shouldn't do that, or to debate those issues.
Mm-hmm.
He just seems to be saying pretty straightforward, like, "Yep, you're right." More of a just sort of broad affirmation than it is anything of real detail there.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, I mean, he could easily have said, like, "Go and sin no more," right? Could have been a response. But that's not his response. It's much more like, "You're telling me the truth. Good job."
I mean, once again, we see, Jesus, sort of sees inside people and knows more than would be readily apparent to anyone else. Just like with Nathaniel and the fig tree,
Mm-hmm.
where he's, and Nathaniel is bowled over because he has this understanding. I guess that's taken to mean this where Nathaniel was a rabbinic student or whatever, but
Mm-hmm.
that he has this background knowledge, and once again, so the woman, all like Nathaniel, is just bowled over, with wow, you must be a prophet. You know my background.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
and then they get to this sort of the background of part of the dispute between the Jews and Samaritans about whether you have to come to the temple in Jerusalem or worship, or whether you can worship at what the Samaritans would consider to be holy sites in their own land.
I have a question about this lady having the 5 husbands. Did they have divorce at that time? I guess I didn't think that you could get a divorce.
They had divorce, certainly. Yeah, so the 5 husbands question, that's always the big one. So what we can say unequivocally, they definitely had divorce. It was possible. Jesus references it in Matthew and has a pretty clear conversation. It's as we had all the conversations about gay marriage and whether or not gay folks should get married, everyone always skipped the actual, and the only time Jesus really talks about marriage is in Matthew, where he says, you have the right to divorce, and because of your hardness of heart, but anyone who gets divorced and gets remarried is committing adultery. And there's a very clear teaching Jesus has about remarriage and his value of marriage that's not really comfortable for our modern world, and almost casual divorce. It is not in the option for Jesus.
Right.
Skip over that one. So there was clearly an idea of that era that you could get divorced, but it was incredibly, incredibly rare from all the records we have and know of. It was not something that happened often and not something that people typically did. What's more likely, and again, we don't have anything other than just knowing she had 5 husbands. What's more likely is that they keep dying on her. This was an era that if you got a bad tooth infection, it could kill you, the next day. We didn't have the antibiotics to keep your body from going into septic shock over any sort of little cut, bruise, or injury. So, again, because there is no condemnation for it, for me, you want to be very careful not to call, and this poor woman gets called a woman of ill repute all the time. Lots of people, I'm sure y'all have heard sermons that will say, oh, this is a woman of ill repute. She had 5 husbands and she's living with a man, and all this kind of stuff. And I'm like, well, but Jesus doesn't condemn at any point any of these things.
Right.
And doesn't rebuke her in any way, shape, or form for it. So I feel like if she was truly a sinful, horrible person, or that either the author would have said as she was a prostitute, or she had other issues, or Jesus would have condemned her, but he doesn't. So there's certainly the possibility that some people in the world just have horrible luck, and she married 5 guys that didn't make it.
Right.
So there's certainly that. Every now and then you will hear people talk about, because she's a Samaritan, and I think I wrote this in some of my notes. Yeah, 5 cents. So we need to refute a couple of things that, as Marcy was talking about, sort of the feminist lens, right? One, nowhere is that listed. People just died a lot in the 1st century before medicine, any sort of idea of modern medicine. Divorce was pretty uncommon, so she could have had 5 husbands and each died. Her 6th boyfriend just might have been worried about bad luck, like, don't marry her. You're not going to make it.
Or something.
Certainly, if I was dating somebody who had 5 husbands and hadn't made it, I'd be wondering if that's a good idea or not.
Sounds like a real hex to me.
Yeah, it could be trouble. But that doesn't make her automatically a person of ill repute, right? That's not how the text describes her. That's not how Jesus describes her. So for me, if Jesus isn't going to condemn her, then I don't have any place to condemn her or declare her of ill repute. The other that we need to name, that some people get really anxious about, they'll say that because she's getting water at noon at the middle of the day, that also proves that she was an outcast within the Samaritan society, that you didn't go and get water in the middle of the day, or you don't, and you still don't in a lot of those places, because that's the hottest part of the day. Unless you really need water, you don't get water. Okay, well, that's reading a lot into the text, number one. Number two, sometimes this happens to all of us. We don't want to go to the grocery store, but we realize, oh, I really need the extra, I forgot the stupid eggs. I got to go back to the store at the middle of the day or whatever. life happens. I don't think there's anything more about it. When I think really when we talk about John, it is more likely that this is, again, symbolic in the same way that Nicodemus shows up to visit Jesus at night. In this case, it's noon. It's fully light. So this person is going to meet the light in the full light of day. Like, she's coming with a better knowledge of what's going on, or symbolically, we know that she's going to receive the light in a very different way than Nicodemus did last week. This is that classic thing that people do a lot of times. They'll say, oh, well, it was literally night, or they'll say this is a proof that she was a harlot and she didn't have good friends. She was going to get water in the middle of the day on this text, but then the one before they'll say, oh, it's symbolic. It was nighttime for Nicodemus, which is really ultimately just that's a sexist reading of the text, quite frankly, because, oh, for a guy it means one thing, a woman it means different, right? I think either we have to read it both the time as the same for both or as very different for both. But in this case, again, for me, you have to be incredibly clear about those passages, that this woman certainly has had a hard time of it, but there's not condemnation about it.
And I think part of what's going on here is the comparison the gospel writer wants to make between sort of the faith practices that are attached to, the comparison is to Jacob's well as opposed to the living water that Jesus seeks to make available. That it just sort of leaves this plain old water and Jacob's well kind of behind in the dust, just like the bountiful jars of wine, put are in a different class than the water for the baptismal rites of the Jews.
Right. I think there's some of that. And that's some of the next part. Some scholars think that this woman might be a bit more metaphorical, that there may not have been literally 5 husbands, but they had a different 5 books of the Bible, that the Jews had Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and Samaritans had different 5 texts. Their Pentateuch was different, so maybe she is married to 5 different ways of believing. Again, I think that's reading a lot into it, and perhaps more metaphorically than I would prefer, but that's certainly that same idea, Lynn, that there's sort of an inherent critique of the Samaritan way of life in this conversation at this point. Just to name it, Mount Gerizim, which is still there, of course, the holy mountain of the Samaritans. That's what Jesus is referencing, or actually the woman's referencing, right? Jesus references it, I'm sorry. Says, this is where you worship, that there are different places where the Samaritans worshipped, and they believe that was the holy mountain. Jews, on the other hand, believe it is Mount Moriah. That's where the Temple of Israel is built in Jerusalem, on top of Mount Moriah, and the location of the binding of Isaac is Mount Moriah in the Jewish tradition. In the Samaritan tradition, Mount Gerizim is where Isaac was bound, and Mount Gerizim is where the temple, the true temple, is built. So that's the difference between the two. And if you're wondering, this is that classic thing that a lot of Christians do. Mount Moriah is one of 3 hills or mountains collectively referred to as Mount Zion in the full area around Jerusalem. So Jerusalem's built in the hill country, and it's built on top of 3 different hills. All 3 of those, it's sort of like the Smoky Mountain range, right? There's individual mountains within the range, and then there's have different names, and then the whole range is called Smoky Mountain. Same thing. Mount Zion is this sort of cluster of hills that are sacred to God. So when they refer to Mount Zion and going to Mount Zion, it's all of Jerusalem. But Mount Moriah is the explicit place where the temple, the first and second temple were built, where the binding of Isaac was held, and actually where the Dome of the Rock now stands, which is, of course, sacred in Islam, is all on Mount Moriah, the one of those 3 hills. That's just so you have your historical references right. But the one thing we can also name is Jesus is comparing Mount Moriah to Mount Gerizim, saying like, oh, salvation comes to the Jews through me. And you claim to worship at Mount Gerizim, and we claim to be at Mount Moriah. But at the end of the day, what I'm bringing in is something completely new, and it doesn't matter if you worship at either of those locations. And there is like Karen said, there is an ecumenical approach that Jesus is making here to a certain degree. Like, okay, well, you're a Samaritan, I'm a Jew, but God's not really worried about either of those or about where you worship. It's more about how you worship and how you engage the divine. Or at least that's the way Jesus is going to be teaching it.
What it says in the Message there is, you worship guessing in the dark. We Jews worship in the clear light of day. God's way of salvation is made available through the Jews, but the time is coming, it has in fact come, when what you're called will not matter and where you go to worship will not matter.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And also gets a good play with light and dark too, with that's certainly the Johannine model.
It's interesting reading.
All right, well, we'll jump to the next. So the woman said to him, I know that Messiah is coming, who is called Christ. This, as I mentioned before, basically they're saying the same thing. Messiah and Christ is just, are you going to use the Hebrew form, which is Mesach or Messiah, or are you going to use the Greek form, which is Christos or Christ? They mean the exact same thing, which is one who is anointed, the anointed of God. So I know that Messiah is coming, who is called Christ, and when he comes, he will proclaim all things to us. And Jesus said to her, I am he, the one who is speaking to you. Just then his disciples came, and they were astonished that he was speaking with a woman, but no one said to him, well, what do you want? Or why are you speaking with her? All right. Then the woman left her water jar and went back to the city, and she said to the people, come and see a man who told me everything I have ever done. He cannot be the Messiah, can he? And they left the city and were on their way to him. All right. Why are the disciples astonished that he was speaking with a woman? This doesn't make sense if we think it is purely if we read purely sacredly, that line doesn't make any sense. It almost sounds like men were not allowed to talk to women at all. That's never been true in any religion in history. So men and women talk all the time, and they have to talk all the time, and they have to engage each other all the time, and flirt and everything else. That's not how people have read it that way, which is a horrible misreading. The reality is, again, this is dating. They are clearly worried that Jesus, who was a good Jew, was dating or flirting with a Samaritan woman. They're a follower of a Jewish Messiah, and they're like, oh, crap, what has he done? Is he marrying a Samaritan? This is not the way this is supposed to go. They are freaking out because they think they have an idea. And it'll become even more clear in the next passage. But again, it is stupid to say that there are rules that men could not speak to women. Claiming Jesus is a feminist just because of this is absolutely foolish. And it's also anti-Semitic. The reality is what happens sometimes when people will preach and teach about this text, they'll say like, oh, Jesus was a good Jew, and that meant he couldn't talk to her, but he also was the Messiah, and that meant he broke these Jewish rules to show that women were equal and all this stuff. Well, first of all, that's not a rule in Judaism. That's not a rule in anything. And it's just creating this false dichotomy to sort of throw shade on Judaism that's not there. That's not how Jewish culture, custom, or tradition works. So Jesus can be a feminist here because he's calling a woman to be his disciple. That's the actual conversation that's going on. That's where you can claim that he is doing something different and new. But it's not just because he talked to her. That's not how this is portrayed. And it's an important thing to note those differences, because it really is, you don't have to denigrate Judaism to make sure that Jesus is doing something different or new. Hope that makes sense. So The other part to name is I am he. And she asks, like, oh, we know he's Messiah. And he says, I am he. In Greek, it is ego eimi. And it should be translated as I am, as in the great I am, as in the words that Moses asks God, what should I call you? I am who I am. God's name in Judaism is, and we're not even supposed to say it, I'm not going to say it, but he is the great I am, right? And so Jesus says this at different points in the text. And because we know from those first chapters that Jesus is God, that Jesus is the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, when he answers her, I am, we hear him say, I am not just Messiah, I am God. But she hears him respond simply saying, like, yeah, I'm the Messiah. Right? And so again, we have this same kind of pun again, where she asks this question of him, are you the Messiah? He says, I am. She hears it as I am the Messiah, but he's really making that deeper declaration that people in the book circle around but never quite get until the end. Before we go to the final sort of section there, what any other thoughts on that passage? I don't think I put it up otherwise.
Well, she came to get water, and she goes back without her jar, much less without water.
Yeah.
Left her water jar.
Left the water, left it all.
Well, she was so excited she forgot what she came for.
Yep.
Well, I think the gospel writer may want us to think that she's begun to receive some of this living water, which keeps her from being thirsty.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, good point.
It's also one of my favorite evangelical claims. Sometimes people want to have this perfect idea of what do I tell people about my relationship with Jesus, or who do I say Jesus is? And her literal pitch is like, he can't be the Messiah, can he? Like it's this very almost double negative. Like, I think that might be it. Come help me figure this out. It's not a declaration of certainty. It's much more I think, but let's figure this out together kind of invitation, right? It's not the perfect sermon on the mountain. It's just, I've experienced this guy. Come and see him. Come and see.
And if you compare this story to the Nicodemus story, I mean, she comes away more certain and goes and, makes a bold statement. And Nicodemus just sort of goes away into the, I don't understand this.
He just filters away, and we just don't see him again until the end of the text almost, right? Yeah. I mean, she absolutely has this conversion, this living water, like Lynn was saying, that bubbling up. Something has been changed in her that's far more clear than what happened with Nicodemus. Nicodemus has not got it figured out, but here this Samaritan woman, this other woman, has a much clearer idea of what's going on. All right, so the next part is probably one of my favorite texts in all of Scripture. If you've been reading all of this as which I do, as sort of flirting and sort of back and forth, as certainly being a conversation that is got some sexual charge to it, has some of this idea of other things happening at multiple levels. Then the next part is the best. The disciples are worried about Jesus, right? So they turn to him and say, meanwhile, the disciples were urging him, Rabbi, eat something. He said to them, I have food to eat that you do not know about. So the disciples said to one another, surely no one's brought them something to eat. Jesus said to them, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and to complete his work. If you go back to the beginning and remember that the courting ritual was you met a girl, you asked her, you met her family, and then you closed the deal with a dinner. You can tell the disciples are freaking out because they're like, oh no, has he gotten engaged to this woman that just ran off? What is happening? Please, can we have lunch with you instead, Jesus? It is absolutely this hilarious sort of, the disciples never get anything right anyway, but in this case, it's hilarious because they are deathly afraid that Jesus has gotten engaged, and Jesus responds both with an invitation to go deeper, like always, but even more, I think he's just teasing his friends. Like, I've got food. My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to complete his work. I mean, I think you can see him saying this, which is, it's completely true, but also completely teasing his friends to be like, oh, guys, it's all good. But stringing them on a little bit, right? They know that process. You meet a girl, you ask a drink, you meet her people, you have a meal. But they're all worried that Jesus got engaged while they went to lunch, like I said. And so again, this whole thing is just hilarious. He's full of teaching and teasing in equal measure. He's teaching them and teasing them, but he knows that they're worried he got engaged. But he's also teaching them in this passage that, hey, we have work ahead, and we need to teach everyone the gospel, even the Samaritans, right? Like, you're worried about me getting engaged to them, but our work is actually deeper than just me getting engaged to them. It's to convert them. It's for them to be part of our community, the whole community, right? So on one, there's sort of a superficial teasing, and then there's also this push, as we'll see in the next passage, for them to go, no, even the Samaritans get to come in on this party. It's not just us. So he strings them along, I think, for a while just because it's funny. Teasing. And then he goes in a little bit more in this sort of final part of the passage. Do you not say 4 months more, then comes the harvest? But I tell you, look around you and see how the fields are ripe for harvesting. Already receiving wages and is gathering fruit for eternal life, so that sower and reaper may rejoice together. For here the saying holds true, one sows, another reaps. I sent you to reap that for which you did not labor. Others have labored, and you have entered into their labor. All right. That's sort of the disciples back and forth. Do you want anything fun to engage with that, or what do y'all hear or say Jesus is doing there? No worries. So then, this is the conclusion of the story, really to Marcy's point, especially about the difference between Nicodemus and this woman. Many Samaritans from that city believed in him because of the woman's testimony. He told me everything I have done. But when the Samaritans came to him, they asked him to stay with them, to abide with them, as we've talked about. That seems to be in the Gospel of John. That's how you truly know that you're a Christian, is if you remain with Jesus, if you stay with Jesus. And so he stayed, he abided with them, he remained there for 2 days. And many more believed because of his word. They said to the woman, it is no longer because of what you said that we believe. We have heard for ourselves, and we know that this is truly the Savior of the world. So what we can say unequivocally is that this woman becomes a disciple and teacher for Jesus in that conversation. We can say unequivocally, and this was used some, not a great deal, but some in the conversations about should we have female priests in the Episcopal Church. This passage was used as one of the big arguments, like, well, Jesus talks to this woman, calls her into service, she goes and preaches and teaches. How is she not on some level a priest, or certainly an early evangelist, if not a full-on priest of the church, right? She brings others in. What else do you need to be successful in the Jesus movement? What else do we hear or see? I don't think I put anything. Yeah. Again, so many preachers and teachers will talk. Well, this is the longest passage that Jesus has of conversation with anyone in the entire New Testament. People will focus falsely and say, oh, well, he's talking to a woman, or wow, he's redeeming the sinful, broken woman. They miss the whole point, the import of the passage, which is Jesus has a long, flirtatious conversation and brings about a conversion. That it is more than just, oh, I met this girl and she's really sweet. She completely believes in who he is and understands it and shares it with people around, becomes a part of the Jesus woman. She becomes a disciple. Then she becomes a full-scale evangelist, bringing her to Jesus, right? I mean, this is no small thing. So, to me, the power of the story is the conversion of Samaria and the deep connections Jesus draws out, all while, quite frankly, laughing and teasing and flirting along the way. It's a deeply human story that, for me at least, is the way I hope God approaches all of us, teasing and flirting and laughing with us without condemnation, even though we may have done wrong or may not. Who knows? That's not the important part. The important part is the conversion and the conversation, not exactly everything we've done right or wrong in the world at this point. That's my thoughts, but y'all might have different take. I'd love to hear it.
Well, I think to the point about the contrast with the Nicodemus story, I do think it's probably quite intentional that the gospel writer brackets, puts this right after the Nicodemus story. That, Nicodemus still leaves in the dark.
Mm-hmm.
And, and this, again, and this is from the perspective of the gospel writer, who's a faithful Jew who's become a follower of Jesus, has been thrown out of the synagogue and is bitter about it.
Right.
And so here's this religious leader who doesn't get it. And then here is Jesus encountering this extreme outsider who is willing to engage and becomes fully engaged and transformed by the encounter, by willing to be open, by abiding with Jesus, and comes to recognize Jesus for who he is.
Absolutely.
And when you were talking about a minute ago, Bill, the laughing Jesus, it brought to my mind's image at Camp Michael. There's a laughing Jesus painting, and it's just an image of him with his head tossed back and just laughing.
Oh, perfect. Yeah. The part of Jesus we don't engage enough, I think, because there are times when I think we need a sarcasm font and we need a laughing commentaries or something. I think he can be both. He's a little sarcastic and teasing and also laughing. He knows us. I sure hope he laughs at us, otherwise we're in trouble.
It's just another piece of the human experience too, that you see him with a sense of humor, and that because so much of the scripture, there's no humor really attributed to Jesus very many places.
Mm-mm.
And I never thought of it being attributed to him in this passage either. So.
Right. No, this one doesn't get taught as a teasing. It's much more serious conversation and conversion than it is about teasing or laughing or joking around. And that's to our poverty, quite frankly. I feel it's sad when we don't.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So next week, we'll look at the end of chapter 4 and the beginning of chapter 5. That's mainly because we have two healing stories back to back, the healing of the official son and the healing of the paralyzed man by the pool of Bethsaida, which are sort of in the other gospels, sort of not. They aren't named the same way. And again, the Gospel of John tends to teach a slightly different version of those stories. We'll look at those healing stories. And I say next week, actually, we'll talk about signs and their meaning in the Gospel of John. That is, signs are the way they refer to miracles. And Jesus has a very specific list of signs. And they even talk about this was the first of his signs, the second of his signs, so that we have an idea of where we are, even in understanding that healing process, those healing miraculous turns. But read ahead, take a peek at what John is doing. I won't be with you next week. I'm going on a quick vacation down to Hilton Head, so I'll be out next Wednesday, and then the following Wednesday, the 29th, we'll gather and visit and talk then. But, look forward to continuing this conversation. It's great. I'm enjoying it. I hope y'all are too.
Yeah.
Yes.
Interesting.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, very much. You guys have a great trip.
We will. Thank you. Thank you. Be with you. Anything else to share or talk or we need to think on? See you, my friends. God bless. We'll talk to you soon.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.